she didn't even look at me when she said it. Gwen Hollister, VP of Global Procurement, just kept staring at her monitor while her fingers clicked through contract cancellations like she was sorting emails. Then, in that same bored voice she used when rejecting budget requests, she dropped the sentence that shattered everything I'd built for the last year and a half. "We don't need your foreign connections anymore." I felt my stomach hollow out. The spreadsheet on her screen listed names I knew by heart. People I'd spent nights calling across time zones, people who trusted me, and with 3 clicks, she erased them like typos. I stood there, still holding the quarterly report I thought we'd be reviewing, while the blood rushed in my ears. She'd just canceled our largest textile supplier in Osaka, the packaging team in Bulgaria, and the precision tooling firm in Mexico City. She didn't even flinch. I wanted to say something, anything, but my voice wouldn't work. It wasn't just that the contracts were gone. It was what they represented. 18 months of flying, learning, listening, building, gone in a sentence. I kept nodding, acting like I understood her logic, but inside, something snapped. Not from anger, not yet. From recognition. Because 15 years ago, someone else had stood quietly in front of Gwen Hollister while she dismantled their life's work. That time, it was my father, and back then, I was a scared teenager watching him fall apart piece by piece. He never raised his voice, never fought back. He just faded. And I promised myself, standing next to his unopened mail and overdue bills, that one day I'd figure out how people like Gwen kept getting away with it. I'd learn their rules. I'd beat them at their own game. Not out of revenge. At least not only that. But because someone needed to. My name is Skye. And this isn't a story about career sabotage or corporate politics. This is about what happens when the invisible people start paying attention. When you spend years preparing not for recognition, but for the exact moment when the person who ruined your family finally lets their guard down. I wasn't hired at Morrison because I was the most brilliant strategist. I was hired because Gwen saw me as useful and unthreatening, and that's exactly what I needed her to see. She thought I was just another eager operations manager who knew a few foreign names and got lucky with suppliers. What she didn't realize was that every email, every deal, every seemingly friendly visit was part of something bigger. I had waited 15 years to stand in that room. I hadn't expected it to feel so quiet, but it did. I left her office without a word. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew it wasn't time yet. That would come later. And when it did, she'd finally understand what my father felt in the end. The quiet, devastating realization that someone you thought was beneath you had just pulled the ground out from under your feet. My father came to this country with nothing but a backpack, an engineering degree, and a pocket full of laminated business cards he printed at the public library. He never complained, not when he worked graveyard shifts to pay for our apartment, not when clients ignored his accent, not even when people called him the wrong name in meetings. He just kept showing up. He built a quiet career out of persistence and humility, becoming one of the few consultants who could navigate contracts in 4 languages without a translator. For 16 years, he helped small manufacturers break into European markets, never asking for credit, just doing the work. Then, his firm got acquired, and with it came Gwen Hollister. She didn't fire him. That would have been too obvious. She just started asking questions in public meetings. Questions that implied doubt. Why were his reports missing minor details? Why hadn't he escalated this issue sooner? Why were his forecasts slightly off by a few percentage points? None of it was serious on its own, but after a while, people started whispering. He was old, out of touch, maybe even slipping mentally. She took his biggest clients and reassigned them to younger consultants with no international experience. Told him it was about realigning resources. When he tried to speak up, she praised his loyalty, but said the company needed to evolve. He spent nights rewriting proposals 5, 6, sometimes 10 times each time, getting vague feedback that felt more like sabotage than support. He started waking up at 4 a.m. just to redo presentations before anyone else got into the office. I remember seeing him at the kitchen table, eyes bloodshot, muttering through spreadsheets like he was reciting prayers. Then came the parking lot. He'd sit in the car for half an hour every morning, hands locked on the steering wheel trying to breathe. Some days, he drove back home without getting out, said he forgot something. Other days, he walked in late cheeks, flushed tie crooked, like he'd just sprinted through a war zone. He never admitted it was panic. He said traffic, or coffee, or allergies. I was 17 and didn't know what anxiety attacks looked like. I thought he was just tired, but tired doesn't explain the tremble in his hands, or the stack of unopened mail on the counter, or the day I came home early from school and found him staring blankly at the wall, wearing a suit he hadn't changed out of for 2 days. That weekend, I saw the termination letter, and the medical bills, and the notice from our landlord about the late rent. He never said Gwen's name. He just said, sometimes people higher up don't care who gets crushed underneath. That Monday morning, I found him at the kitchen table, head down, a cup of cold coffee next to his hand. The room was silent, but something about it felt final. The paramedics said it was his heart, the stress, the lack of sleep, maybe genetics, but I knew better. It was slow death by humiliation, the kind you can't diagnose but you feel in your bones, the kind that strips away someone's worth one meeting at a time. I sat next to him for hours before I called anyone, and in that silence I made a promise. One day I'd find out how people like Gwen kept getting away with it, how they walked through broken lives like stepping stones without ever looking down. I didn't want revenge. I wanted understanding, because if I could understand it, maybe I could stop it, or at least make sure no one else had to watch someone they love get erased in real time. After my father died, I didn't spiral. I planned. While other kids in my high school were figuring out where they wanted to go to college based on campus vibes or football teams, I was making spreadsheets. I looked up Gwen Hollister's career path, mapped her promotions, tracked the companies she worked for, and the mergers she managed. I saw how she maneuvered through acquisitions, how she built influence in supply chains, and how she left behind the same quiet devastation in every role. I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted to understand what gave her power. So I chose supply chain management. It sounded boring to most people, but it was the bloodstream of every company, and it gave people like Gwen their leverage. I majored in international procurement and studied contract law on the side. I interned with small firms that still did things by handshake and trust just to understand what vulnerability looked like. After graduation, I didn't rush. I took jobs that let me travel. I worked on packaging compliance in Southeast Asia, coordinated textile shipments from Eastern Europe, and even shadowed customs brokers in Tijuana for 6 months. Every role was a lesson. Every mistake I saw a manager make became part of my case study collection. I kept my resume modest, never flashy. Enough to look competent, never enough to seem ambitious. I knew I needed to look like someone reliable, hardworking, and grateful for the opportunity. Someone Gwen would ignore. When the opening came at Morrison Industries, I applied within an hour. She was listed as the hiring manager. I sent in a tailored cover letter that praised her efficiency and complimented the company's global strategy. I made myself sound eager to learn, eager to serve. The interview was short. She barely looked up from her notes. I could tell she'd already decided I was safe. Once I was in, I stayed quiet. I took the worst travel assignments. I made jet lag look like a badge of honor. I solved issues that senior staff found too messy, too foreign, too complicated. I got birthday cards for Gwen's assistant, and I always brought back local tea when I traveled. I let myself be underestimated. It wasn't hard. Most of the team saw me as sweet, but a little obsessive. That was fine. Obsessive people don't get promoted. They just get relied on. I asked just enough questions to seem curious, but never the kind that hinted at strategy. I volunteered for every late-night call with overseas partners, the kind no one wanted to deal with. I listened more than I spoke, and I made sure every solution I suggested came with a line about how Gwen's leadership had inspired it. I took notes in meetings, but never corrected anyone, even when they were wrong, especially when they were wrong. My goal was not to shine. My goal was to get close enough to the machinery that I could see how everything fit together. And I did. By month 6, I understood the full structure of Morrison's international procurement flow. I knew which vendors were essential and which ones were replaceable. I saw how Gwen signed contracts without reading them as long as they promised short-term savings. I watched her dismiss overseas partners as dramatic or emotional. I cataloged the phrases she used. Complications, overhead, not scalable. I kept a running file. But none of that would matter if I weren't trusted, so I built relationships. I called partners just to check in. I asked about their families, their goals, and what they hoped to grow into. I showed up on site even when it wasn't necessary. I didn't pitch Morrison as a savior. I presented ourselves as a partner, and I told them carefully that it was important to always protect themselves in contracts. That even good companies could change when leadership changed. I said that because I meant it, and because it would matter later. Inside Morrison, I became the person who could fix things without needing credit. Outside Morrison, I became the person they remembered. It took 18 months to build the web, to make sure every supplier was connected not just to me but to each other. I didn't need them to like me. I needed them to believe I would never put them in harm's way. And I wouldn't, not unless Gwen gave me no choice, not unless she made the same mistake twice. The first time I met Aiko, she offered me slippers at the door of her family's textile facility in Osaka. Her hands were rough from years of dye work, but her voice was gentle and precise. She walked me through looms her grandfather had built by hand after the war, each one still running, still producing fabric with patterns older than I was. Her company wasn't big, but it was known for its craftsmanship. She told me the American distributor she trusted in the 90s had vanished overnight with 2 years of product and 0 payment. Her father had nearly lost everything. She was rebuilding not for profit, but for pride. Miguel in Mexico City was different. His precision tooling shop felt more like a lab than a factory. Clean floors, soft music, and 3 generations of knowledge humming through the machines. He introduced me to his daughters over lunch, all studying engineering and hoping to join the family business. Miguel had once partnered with a U.S. firm that promised aerospace contracts then pulled out at the last minute, leaving him with debt he wasn't sure he'd recover from. He said he wasn't bitter, just cautious. His machines, he told me, were calibrated to tolerances no one else in the region could match. Not because he wanted to compete with the big players, because his grandfather once said, doing things right is its own kind of protest. Then there was the Petrova family in Bulgaria. Their packaging plant sat in a quiet rural town where jobs were few and stories were long. Elena Petrova walked me through the facility with her sleeves rolled up and her phone on silent. Her grandmother had used her pension as collateral to start the company after their family fled political unrest. They made biodegradable packaging before it was trendy, long before it was profitable. Years ago, a partnership with a U.S. brand had opened doors for them. Then when that brand reorganized, the Petrovas were ghosted, orders stopped, emails went unanswered. They held on, but just barely. Now every contract they signed came with a cautious heart. Each of them carried scars. Not just from economic loss, but from being treated like they didn't matter. From promises broken quietly without explanation. From being told they were too small, too slow, too foreign. And still, they opened their doors to me. They poured tea, gave tours, and introduced me to their workers like family. I didn't bring them miracle deals. I brought consistency. I returned calls. I remembered birthdays. I asked about their goals, not just their costs. And slowly we built something that didn't look like strategy. It looked like trust. They never knew my full story. I never talked about my father. But when I listened to theirs, I saw him everywhere. In this way, Miguel kept every invoice in triplicate. In the way Elena checked every contract clause twice before signing. In the way Aiko lit incense before each production run like a ritual to hold on to what mattered. I wasn't just doing my job. I was choosing people I believed in. People who had been tested and kept building anyway. And over time, they began to believe in me too. Not because of Morrison, but in spite of it. Because I saw them. And I made sure they knew I always would. It started small. A line here, a clause there. Language that looked like standard international protections but had teeth if used right. Every time I negotiated a new contract, I included provisions around withdrawal rights, penalty triggers, and mutual notification windows. Most companies skim that part, especially if the price looks good. Gwen never read them. She was focused on numbers, short-term savings, and the glow of quarterly wins. I made sure the language was clean, legal, and boring enough to keep her from asking questions. To the partners, I framed it as protection. I told them stories about what I'd seen in other firms. Executives who pivoted strategies overnight. Departments that changed direction without warning. I didn't name Gwen. I didn't need to. I just told them that corporate priorities sometimes shift fast, and when they do, the ones who suffer are often the ones furthest from headquarters. I said I'd seen it happen, that it wasn't about bad people, just bad habits. That if they wanted to avoid sudden shutdowns, we should build in some guardrails. Nobody argued. Most of them had been burned before. By the 12th month, every international contract had a coordinated withdrawal clause, quiet, mutual, and legal. If Morrison terminated any of them without cause, the others could walk. No fees, no delays. All they had to do was notify each other. It was protection dressed as formality. I checked and double-checked every agreement. I ran the language through 2 translators and a legal advisor on my own time. I wasn't leaving room for misunderstanding. And I talked, not gossip, not warnings, just patterns. I told them how certain executives view overseas vendors. How phrases like cultural inefficiencies or too much hand-holding are red flags. How to tell when a company stops seeing you as a partner and starts seeing you as a cost center. I never used fear. I used my experience. I made it clear they weren't alone, that other suppliers in other countries were asking the same questions, and that if things ever changed, they wouldn't be left to figure it out by themselves. Most of them understood what I was doing long before I spelled it out. We didn't need to say it out loud. The trust was already there. Aiko started checking in with Petrova directly. Miguel joined a group chat with our Vietnamese packaging partners. Slowly, they began sharing updates, small wins, shipment delays, and market shifts. Nothing formal, just people looking out for each other. I didn't organize it. I didn't need to. I'd picked the right people. They built the rest. Inside Morrison, I kept my head down. My reports focused on metrics. My slide decks highlighted cost savings. Every signature Gwen gave me made the trap stronger, but it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like responsibility. Like I was finally balancing something that had been tilted too long. I didn't know when the moment would come. I just knew it would. And when it did, I wanted to be ready. Not to destroy something, but to protect the people who had trusted me. The ones no one else was watching. The ones I refused to let be erased. I walked into her office expecting a routine quarterly review. That morning, Morrison had posted record profits, and most of it was tied to the international contracts I'd negotiated. I'd printed summaries, slides, and even brought a list of supplier recommendations for future projects. Gwen didn't look up when I entered. She gestured to the chair across from her without saying a word. Her computer screen reflected in her glasses as her fingers tapped calmly across the keyboard. I waited, thinking she might ask about projections or updates. Instead, she said it. "We don't need your foreign connections anymore." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her right. She kept scrolling. Line by line, she canceled the contracts. Aiko's textiles. The Petrova's packaging materials. Miguel's tooling components. Each name blinked off the screen, like a light being switched off. She said the shift to domestic suppliers would simplify logistics and cut emotional complexity, that we were a modern company and needed modern partners. I said nothing. I just watched, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt everything. Anger, grief, control. When she finished, she smiled, proud of herself. She told me it was good for my professional growth, that I'd gotten too attached. Then she dismissed me like she'd done something noble. I thanked her, not because I meant it, because it was time. I walked out of her office, past the open floor cubicles and the glass conference rooms. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. It was quiet inside me, like standing in the eye of a storm. I didn't go back to my desk. I went straight to the restroom, locked the stall, and pulled out my phone. Aiko answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert. It was 3 a.m. in Osaka. I told her we needed to activate the clause. No questions, just action. She understood. She always did. She said she would contact the Petrovas. I ended the call and moved to Miguel. He didn't ask why. He asked how long we had. I said 12 hours. Within minutes, the chain began. The Petrovas reached out to their packaging partners in Vietnam. Miguel contacted our tooling collaborators in Taiwan. The network I'd built in silence was now speaking. They weren't panicked. They were prepared. That was the difference. I had never promised them Morrison would last. I promised them I would tell them when it didn't, and now I was keeping that promise. By the time I walked out of the building, 12 suppliers across 8 countries had started reviewing their contracts. Some called each other, some called me. A few didn't say anything at all. They just acted. The clause was clear. If one contract was terminated without cause, the rest could withdraw immediately. Gwen had triggered them all with one decision. One smirk, one sentence. I stood on the sidewalk outside Morrison's glass tower and looked up. The lights on the top floors were still glowing. I knew inside someone was probably praising her for cutting costs, for streamlining the process, for taking initiative. But by morning, those same people would be asking questions they didn't know how to answer, and I wouldn't need to explain anything. I had already said what needed to be said, just not to them. Not yet. They would hear it soon enough. In silence, in missing shipments, in halted production lines, in the empty space where trust used to live. By mid-morning on Tuesday, people were pacing. Phones were ringing nonstop, but not in the usual way. Not in that steady rhythm of normal operations. It was frantic, clipped, and nervous. Procurement leads couldn't reach suppliers. Operations teams started pulling backup inventory. By 10, the first production line halted. Not for maintenance, not for quality control. Just silence. The parts weren't there. Not from Osaka, not from Bulgaria, not from Mexico City. At first, people blamed logistics. Maybe a customs delay. Maybe a mislabeled shipment. Then they realized it wasn't one supplier. It was nearly all of them, and they weren't answering follow-up emails with solutions. They were citing clauses, the contract language that most of the staff had never read. Legal was the first to panic. They found the withdrawal provision and couldn't believe it had passed review. But it had. Quietly, cleanly. Authored by me. Approved by Gwen. By noon, floor managers were escalating. Meetings started overlapping. Teams huddled in conference rooms while whiteboards were filled with urgent sourcing requests. No one could explain how the company had become this dependent on a supply chain it no longer had access to. Some asked if the vendors had coordinated, but there were no messages, no protests, no demands, just silence. That afternoon, the CEO called an emergency executive meeting. He didn't usually show up for procurement crises, but this wasn't a crisis. It was a collapse. I wasn't supposed to be in the room. I wasn't senior enough. But he asked for me by name, said I was the only person who might understand what was happening. Gwen looked confused when I walked in. Not angry, not threatened, just genuinely confused. I took a seat across the table without looking at her. The CEO opened with one question. How do we go from record profits to production shutdown in 4 days? Gwen launched into a polished explanation. Domestic diversification, long-term savings, strategic pivots. She had charts, color-coded graphs, risk assessments. None of them matched reality. Then he turned to me. Skye, he said, tell me what actually happened. I opened my laptop and pulled up the data. Not just numbers, photos, testimonials, contract timelines. Supplier investments are made in good faith. I explained the relationships we'd built, the clauses Gwen had triggered, the trust that had been broken. The room went quiet, and Gwen for once had nothing to say. She kept flipping through her own slides like they'd changed when no one was looking. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I didn't have to. The collapse had spoken louder than I ever could. All I did was show them what they already knew. That someone they'd overlooked had been holding everything together, and that now, without her connections, Morrison was falling apart. I started with Aiko, a photo of her standing in her family's textile facility next to looms passed down through 3 generations. I showed how she had retooled her operation specifically for Morrison's orders, hiring 12 new workers based on our long-term projections. Then I moved to a letter she sent me the night after her contract was canceled. In it, she wrote that the language used by our VP had reminded her of the American distributor who abandoned her father's business decades ago. This time, the damage wouldn't just be financial, it would be personal. Next was Miguel. I brought up photos of his tooling machines custom-built for aerospace precision. I showed his daughters in their school uniforms, their scholarships funded by Morrison's business. Then I displayed the clause in his agreement that allowed immediate withdrawal, triggered by unjustified termination. He had used it not in anger, but out of necessity. His email was short. He said he had learned to trust people, not logos. Then I showed the Petrovas. Their plant is in rural Bulgaria. Workers on break beside a handmade sign that said, "Stability means dignity." I shared a note Elena sent the morning her contract vanished. She didn't blame us. She blamed herself for trusting again. She said the silence after her last American partnership collapsed had been worse than the bankruptcy. I laid out each story in order, their contributions, their history, the risk they took in trusting us. Then I presented the coordinated clause, the language Gwen had signed off on over and over without question. I explained that these suppliers didn't just withdraw because they were hurt. They withdrew because they were prepared, because I had helped them prepare. The CEO listened without interruption. Gwen shifted in her chair, trying not to look at the screen. When I reached the final slide, I said what needed to be said. This wasn't a logistics failure. It was a relationship failure. It happened because someone with power chose to treat these partners as disposable. The reaction we saw wasn't retaliation. It was self-defense. I wasn't angry when I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call for punishment. I just showed them the truth. What they did with it was no longer my responsibility. But for the first time, it wasn't invisible, and Gwen couldn't unsee it. Not this time. 3 weeks later, the company made it official. Gwen would be transitioning to a customer service role focused on domestic accounts. The announcement was framed as a strategic realignment, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. There was no public reprimand, no dramatic fall from grace, just a quiet repositioning, a soft landing for someone who had built her career on hard landings for others. I didn't ask for a title, but I was given one, Director of Global Supplier Relations. I was handed full authority to rebuild the international network Morrison had lost. Not because of seniority, but because the board finally understood who had been holding the threads. I spent the next 6 months meeting with former partners not to convince them but to listen. Some asked for oversight structures. Others requested written guarantees. Many just needed to hear that the leadership had changed. I never told anyone about my father, not the CEO, not my new team, not even the suppliers who had reminded me of him. I didn't need to. His story had already played out in every moment of this journey. Justice didn't come from telling it. It came from correcting the imbalance that had made it possible. Gwen lasted 8 months in her new role. I heard she now manages customer complaints at a regional center. Most people forget what they did once they lose the title, but I don't think she will. Not because of me, because of the silence that followed her. The kind of silence that teaches. I didn't get everything back. No one does. But I kept my promise. And that more than anything was enough. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Not just for listening, but for caring about something that doesn't always make headlines. Because the truth is, what holds companies, communities, and lives together isn't policy or profit. It's people. And the way we treat those people, especially when no one's watching, says everything about who we are. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was about remembering. About what happens when we don't forget the people others ignore. The partners, the families, the quiet workers who give everything and ask only for fairness in return. So, if you take anything from this, let it be this. Patience is power. Respect is a strategy. And sometimes The most lasting change begins with a single, quiet promise. If this made you think about someone you've underestimated or overlooked, I hope you reach out. If it reminded you of a time you felt invisible, I hope it helps you feel seen. And if you know there are more stories like this waiting to be told, maybe now is the time to tell them.